So what is the new consciousness? It is access to non-physical reality. As we become multisensory, we begin to realize that we are living in a learning environment. You are the authority in your life. You are responsible for the choices that you make. So why allow anyone else to make your choices for you? You can, of course. That's what most people do, almost everyone. That's living an unconscious life. It means that you are creating with fear. Now, by fear, I don't mean fear and trembling, but fear has many ways of expressing itself. Anger, jealousy, resentment, competitiveness, superiority, and entitlement. But when you know it, when you're aware of it, when you feel it, it becomes conscious, and then you're in a position to change your life. This is part of the new consciousness. Whenever you have the thought, or the impulse, or the suspicion from here, that you are more than a mind and a body, that is a multisensory impulse, because you are. Hello. It's wonderful for me to be with you again. Welcome. On our last podcast, I began to answer the question, what is the inspiration for the seat of the soul? Where did that come from? That came from the same place that everything in my life comes from now, but I didn't realize it at the time. It comes from the universe. It comes from a wisdom far greater than mine. But is it really far greater than mine if I can share it with you? That means, are you a wise person? Well, if you're like me, probably not, but do you recognize wisdom when you hear it? Well, what's the difference? Then begin to orient yourself toward the wisdom that you recognize, and you move in the direction of being aware of your origin and the origin of what you're saying and sharing when it comes from your heart. And that's the universe. Actually, everything comes from the universe. There's nothing apart from it. It's really quite remarkable. And this podcast is about that. That's why the name of this podcast is The New Consciousness. So in the last podcast, I began my sharing of the inspiration for what's in the seat of the soul, which is a book that was published in '89. And it is about the new consciousness. And I explained that I had been invited to Sweden to speak at a top-level conference because the book that I'd written earlier, 10 years earlier, had won the American Book Award for Science. It was about quantum physics. And when I arrived, I was jet-lagged, and the conference organizer invited all of us in, including my colleague Edgar Mitchell, the Apollo 14 astronaut, and introduced us to this channeled entity. I had nothing but disdain for channeled entities. I thought that was all New Age fluff, and I was tired. The next day, the organizer invited me to see this channeled entity again, and I accepted simply because I was curious, and I was startled by what happened. The channeled entity knew things about me that no one could have known, and that opened me and my understanding, or at least my acceptance, far beyond what it was before. And that was just the beginning. What happened after the beginning is what I'm going to discuss with you now in this podcast. It was the next step. About 4 or 5 years after I met Ambrose in Sweden, a friend of mine said to me playfully, I channel a non-physical teacher. Would you like to meet it? Well, after my experience with Ambrose, I said yes, because I was no longer someone who was disdainful about non-physical entities. And by the way, I want to share with you now that not all non-physical entities are wise. Not all of them, I think, are even beneficent. I've met, because people have offered them to me, their teachers, and their teachers don't seem to know much more than I know. So there isn't much gain in talking to such a teacher. But I only have 2 teachers, and my spiritual partner, Linda Francis. And both of them are like Ambrose, remarkable, present, aware completely of things beyond my awareness and beyond me, but in a good way. Now I met a second non-physical teacher. This teacher was named Genesis. I said, "What's your name?" He said, "You can call me Genesis." I don't know if it's a he or not. I asked Genesis, "What are you once?" And he said, "I'm an angel." And I said, "What's that?" He said, "I'm a non-physical. I'm an energy dynamic that's evolved in its ability to support the Earth School, which is where we are now, and beyond." So I told my friend, "Yes, I want to meet Genesis." And my friend closed her eyes, seemed to go to sleep, and another voice appeared coming through her. She afterwards didn't know what had happened, but I did. So the first thing Genesis said to me, without an introduction, was, "How can I help you?" And I said, "Well, I've had some health challenges and some issues in my life that I hope we can talk about." What I had in my heart to say was this: "Genesis, I can't stop thinking about sex. I can't stop looking for sex with women. I can't stop having sex with women. And I have herpes. Will you please help me?" And Genesis said, "Let us move into healing, shall we?" He said, "Let us move into healing," before I spoke the question in my heart. How did he know that? How did he know what my essence wanted to know from him? But he did. And he began speaking. And as we moved into healing, it surprised me even more. It wasn't healing like anything I had ever thought of before. Instead, he said, "The issue for you specifically is not sexuality. It is the nature of love." Oh, almost immediately, my concern with my addiction to sex and herpes, Genesis put in a new and expanded context of love, the nature of love. But what did this have to do with love? And that's what I was beginning to learn from Genesis. He said, "You have never experienced love between two individuals without fear, without guarding yourself, without having your defenses up." And he explained, even in physiological terms, what that was for me. And then, after doing that, he said, "So what you are really experiencing now is, and what we are talking about now, is the nature of power." Oh my goodness. We had quickly gone from herpes, sex, to the nature of love, to the nature of power. What could power have to do with any of that? And Genesis told me, it always happens when two people are in an interaction and when they're in a relationship, that there is a necessity, a need to balance between, on the one hand, a balanced relationship, and on the other hand, your integrity. And that is what you are experiencing. And as he spoke, every other or every third or fourth sentence that Genesis spoke registered in me. Said, "Yes, I know that. I know that." He said, "Because there is this fear in you and your lack of ability to experience love without the guards up. Every experience of sexuality for you translates into a taking of your power." Oh my gosh. Yes, exactly. And so began my experience with Genesis. I first met Genesis in September of 1985. So what is it now? We're almost in 2025. What is that? That's 15, 30, 40 years. This is 40 years ago. And I have been learning from this angel, been mentored by this angel in all that I do and all that I share. And Linda also met Genesis after we came together. And that's why, before we start any event, and at the beginning of every book and talk and gathering like this one, I say, I do not expect you to accept anything that I say is true, or what I say is true, or so, just because I say it. Instead, look to see, feel to see if you resonate with anything that I'm saying. And if you do, then experiment with that. Take that into your life and see what you create, what it creates. And if that's good and you like it, then continue to experiment. You have a life to experiment with. And if you don't resonate with anything that I say, let it go. Don't try to wear a shoe that pinches. And I suggest that you not take as so anything that anyone says, even if they have a television show, even if they've written books, even if they have a huge congregation. You are the authority in your life. You are responsible for the choices that you make. You will experience the consequences that they create. So why allow anyone else to make your choices for you? You can, of course. That's what most people do, almost everyone. That's living an unconscious life. And when you live an unconscious life, it means this, not only that you're unaware of many things that you're actually experiencing and reacting or responding to, it means that you are creating with fear. Now, by fear, I don't mean fear and trembling, like frightened. Well, I do mean like frightened. But fear has many ways of expressing itself. Anger, jealousy, resentment, competitiveness, superiority and entitlement. That was a big one for me. So was anger. Inferiority and needing to please. But these two can switch. You can switch from feeling inferior and needing to please and entitled and superior in a moment. Without knowing it, it's unconscious. But when you know it, when you're aware of it, when you feel it, it becomes conscious, and then you're in a position to change your life. Not that your life will change, but that you are now in a position to change your life. And that takes us to another step in creating authentic power. But I will return now to Genesis, where I was learning all of this. After a couple of years, my friend and I found that we needed to move. Our lives were taking us in different directions. And this was a concern to me because Genesis had become such an important part of my life. I, who wrote a book that won the American Book Award for Science on quantum physics, I, who, by the blessing of the universe, got a scholarship to Harvard and graduated from there, I, who was completely an intellectual, was in distress that I wasn't going to be able to speak to my non-physical teacher anymore. And as I was driving back to the house where we were staying one evening, I had a thought. And after that thought, I had another one, much more exciting. And my second thought was, I bet Genesis gave me that thought. I bet he did. I could hardly wait to get back to the house. And when I got back and could speak with Genesis again, I asked Genesis, did you give me that thought? And Genesis said, yes, I did. Can you recognize the voice that you heard when you heard that thought? Oh, I had to look inside. I had so many voices in my head, and I looked. And yes, I realized I can recognize that voice. And Genesis said, well done. Communication is established. And that was the beginning of the next beginning of my experiences with Genesis. I hope this is answering your question about where the inspiration for the seed of the soul comes from. It's where my ability to explain this comes from. It's not beyond my ability to understand it, although it is, and we'll get into that in a later podcast, far beyond my ability to understand, but not to experience, not to feel, not to live with. Then Genesis said, as I was frightened of my friend moving in a different direction, Genesis said, me you will not lose. And I asked Genesis, will there come a time when I can speak with you and hear you as clearly as I do now? And he said, yes, I can guarantee you that. And then we said farewell and ended that conversation. This is what I have the joy to share with you in this episode of this podcast. This is what I have the joy and the fulfillment to share with you in all the books that I've written or that my beloved Linda Francis and I have written, in all the lectures that we've given, the talks that we've given, everything that we've shared. It's so exciting to me. What is exciting? The new consciousness, after which this podcast is named, the new consciousness. This is part of the new consciousness. That's why I'm sharing it this intimately with you, because I'm not sharing the new consciousness as an idea or a concept or an inspiration, but as a reality that is now emerging in hundreds of millions of us. And you are one of them, or you would not be listening to this podcast. So what is the new consciousness other than what I've described? First of all, there are so many ways to wisdom and to love. This is my greatest joy. And it's a unique joy in a unique way in each of us. You do have non-physical teachers. There's no doubt about that. When we were in the old consciousness, 5-sensory consciousness, anything that couldn't be detected by the 5 senses was determined by the intellect to be non-existent, to be illusory or an illusion or hallucination. Now you're multisensory and you resonate with what I'm sharing. And if you do, that is a multisensory perception. And my intention is to introduce the new consciousness, which is multisensory perception, in a way that you understand clearly. It's not my thought. It's not my idea. It's even more than my inspiration. It's reality. It is access to non-physical reality. That is the new consciousness. Before, there was no other reality except in theology or religion or philosophy. But as we become multisensory, we begin to realize that we are living in a learning environment, and that is the Earth School. The Earth School is a domain of time, space, matter, and duality. None of those exist outside of the Earth School. Not time, not space, not fear, and not duality. The new consciousness, as it emerges, is giving us access to non-physical reality. Now, what does that look like in your life beyond these experiences that I've described? Whenever you have the thought or the impulse or the suspicion from here that you are more than a mind and a body, that is a multisensory impulse, because you are. Your personality has an immortal aspect to it, a component that existed before you were born and that will continue to exist after you die. And beginning to suspect that is multisensory perception. Maybe you have a hunch sometime when you look at the world or something that's happening in front of you and you think, maybe the world isn't random. Maybe it isn't just happening. Maybe it's meaningful. Maybe I can learn something from it. Not about the world, but about me. That is a multisensory perception. Maybe sometimes you see someone and you know things about that person that your five senses could not have shared with you. For example, you know that person is unhappy, or you know that person just got divorced. How could you know that? Or you know that person, even though they're polite and polished and well-dressed, is not to be trusted. But you know that. That is a multisensory perception. And this is the beginning of the new consciousness. And I'm grateful to be able to share it with you. So now, as you leave this podcast and go to whatever you're doing, I suggest that you take whatever resonated with you in this podcast with you to work, to your family, to your children, to school, and apply whatever was most and is most resonant with you. And then write it down. Set a notebook aside. Call it a journal. That's a lovely name. Because a journal means you're doing more than taking notes. You're recording something that's worthwhile. And then see what considering, not even practicing, but considering what you have resonated with as possibly so for you might be like in your life and how it might be helpful to you in your life. Helpful to do what? To be more accepting, flexible, understanding of others, and loving. It's a joy to speak with you again. Please come again to the New Consciousness podcast, and we'll discuss it further. In fact, we'll take the next step. I'm Gary Zukav.